What happens when a simple act of kindness changes everything? James Kensington, a Canadian millionaire, embarks on a life-changing journey with his daughter Isabella. What begins as a celebration of her 18th birthday turns into a story of generosity, compassion, and transformation. Join us in this heartwarming tale that proves true wealth isn't about what you have, but what you give. Don't miss out. Hit the subscribe button now and be part of stories that inspire and uplift. Let's begin this unforgettable journey together. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the waters of San Diego Bay as the ferry slowly glided back toward the city. James Kensington, a Canadian millionaire known for his vast fortune and philanthropic heart, leaned against the rail, his gaze lost in the peaceful rhythm of the sea. Beside him stood his daughter, Isabella, who was bubbling with excitement, her eyes wide with wonder. The two had just returned from Coronado Island, a beautiful escape to celebrate Isabella's 18th birthday, a milestone she had dreamed of for years. For James, this trip was more than just a birthday celebration. It was a moment to share with his daughter the joy of a life well lived, a life he had built from nothing. Since the 1990s, James had dedicated himself to charitable causes across Latin America, using his wealth to create change in underprivileged communities. His successful investments in retail chains had made him one of the wealthiest men in Canada, but it was his heart for the poor that defined him. He was a man who believed in giving back, not just through money, but through genuine, life-changing acts of kindness. Today, however, everything was about to change. As the ferry rocked gently on the waves, James reached into his pocket for his wallet. It was a small, sleek leather wallet, simple yet important, holding more than just cash. Inside were vital documents, including his ID, credit cards, and business cards that connected him to people around the world. But as his fingers brushed against the fabric of his pants, a cold realization washed over him. His wallet was gone. For a brief moment, James thought he might be mistaken. Maybe it had slipped under the seat, or perhaps it had fallen out in the cabin. But as he checked his pockets again, the pit in his stomach deepened. No wallet. Panic began to creep in, but James quickly stilled his racing heart. This wasn't the first time he'd encountered a setback in his life, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. But he couldn't shake the feeling that this was different. "Isabella," he called out, his voice steady but with a trace of concern. "Have you seen my wallet?" Isabella turned, her face filled with innocence and curiosity. "What do you mean, Dad?" James smiled weakly, trying to mask the growing anxiety. "I think I've lost it." The young woman's expression immediately changed. "Dad, no, you must be mistaken. How could you lose it now? We're on our way back to the city." "I know," James said, trying to sound reassuring, though he was beginning to doubt himself. "But it's not just about money. I've got my ID and some important documents in there." Isabella's face shifted from concern to disbelief. "You think someone on the island?" "Let's not jump to conclusions," James interrupted gently, trying to calm her nerves. "It's possible I misplaced it." But even as the words left his mouth, he wasn't so sure. He couldn't shake the memory of their visit to a local, poorer neighborhood earlier that day. They had made a stop on their way back from Coronado Island, and while James had always prided himself on helping those in need, he couldn't help but wonder, was this a moment where his own generosity had made him vulnerable? The ferry slowly made its way back to the dock, and the father and daughter walked in silence. James couldn't stop thinking about the contents of his wallet, the cash that could now be used for any purpose, the credit cards that would need to be canceled, and, more troubling than anything, the personal papers that could cause a lot of problems if they fell into the wrong hands. "Maybe it was someone from the neighborhood we visited," Isabella said, breaking the silence. Her voice was filled with skepticism. "There were a lot of people there. Maybe they saw us as easy targets." James sighed deeply, but his mind raced in a different direction. "It's possible, yes, but I trust that we'll find it. There's good in people, even in places where we least expect it." Despite his outward calm, James couldn't ignore the growing knot in his stomach. He had faced many challenges in his life, growing up in poverty, losing loved ones, navigating the ruthless world of business. But losing his wallet, the one thing that tied him to this trip, to his life as it stood now, felt like a test he wasn't prepared for. The ferry docked, and as they walked toward the hotel, James couldn't shake the unease that had settled over him. This wasn't just about a lost wallet. Something deeper was at play here, and he couldn't help but feel that this was the beginning of a journey that would change everything, for him and for Isabella. As they entered the hotel lobby, he looked over at his daughter, who was already checking her phone for any news of the missing wallet. He gave her a soft smile, though he felt a pang of guilt. He had promised her that this would be a special trip, one filled with memories that would last a lifetime. But now, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he couldn't help but wonder if the adventure had just begun. The ferry continued its gentle sway as it made its way back to San Diego, the calm evening breeze ruffling James's hair. But inside, his mind was a whirlwind. He reached for his pocket again, half hoping that the wallet would have magically reappeared, but the space was empty. A cold knot of realization tightened in his chest. It was gone. Isabella, who had been glancing out at the water, turned to her father. "Dad, what's wrong?" she asked, noticing the change in his demeanor. James hesitated, unwilling to fully admit it yet. He didn't want to alarm her. "I think I've lost my wallet." Isabella raised an eyebrow. "You lost it? How could you?" She trailed off, her voice tinged with disbelief. "When was the last time you had it?" James racked his memory, searching for the exact moment he'd last seen it. He recalled that earlier in the day, when they had stopped at a small market in the heart of the low-income neighborhood, he had pulled it out to buy a souvenir for Isabella. The place had been bustling, crowded with street vendors and families going about their daily lives, a sharp contrast to the lavish world James was accustomed to. The memory now felt distant, almost surreal, as if that moment had belonged to another time or another life. "I used it when we bought those bracelets in the market," James said, his voice quiet, almost as if he were trying to convince himself that it was just a small mistake. "It must have slipped out of my pocket when we were walking around." Isabella crossed her arms, her expression skeptical. "Are you sure you just misplaced it, Dad?" She glanced at the crowd around them on the ferry, as if searching for someone who might have taken it. That neighborhood was not exactly the most secure. Don't you think someone might have taken it? James was taken aback by the edge in his daughter's voice. He understood her concerns. They had just walked through an area that, although full of culture and history, was also fraught with poverty and hardship. It was a place where many struggled to make ends meet, and the sight of so many people living in cramped conditions had been unsettling for Isabella. "I know it's a rough area," James said gently, trying to calm her, "but I don't think anyone would steal from us. We were just there to give back, to help. We're not the ones to judge or assume." He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I'm sure it's just a mistake. I probably left it behind when we left the market." Isabella didn't seem convinced. Her eyes narrowed as she glanced over the people aboard the ferry. "I don't know, Dad. After everything we saw there, I just have this feeling. Maybe they saw us as easy targets. It's easy to take advantage of someone who's trying to help." James sighed, feeling a pang of guilt. He had always told Isabella that kindness and generosity were to be extended without hesitation, no matter the circumstances. But her words stung in a way he hadn't anticipated. What if, in trying to do good, he had been naive? What if their gesture of goodwill had been misinterpreted as an opportunity to take advantage of them? "I don't want to jump to conclusions," James said firmly. "Let's just see what happens. There's still a chance it'll turn up." As the ferry docked and the city skyline of San Diego grew larger in the distance, James felt an unease settling in his chest. He had built his fortune over the years through strategic investments, yes, but also by trusting his instincts, his gut feeling about people and situations. And right now, his gut was telling him something was off. They arrived back at their hotel, and James tried to focus on the trip, trying to keep up the facade of calm for Isabella's sake. But inside, he was anxious, replaying the events of the day in his mind. The feeling of his wallet slipping from his fingers, the vibrant energy of the market, the quick exchanges with vendors. Had someone seen him as an easy mark? He pulled out his phone and checked it again. No missed calls, no messages. "Let me make some calls," he told Isabella as they entered the hotel lobby. He approached the front desk and explained his situation to the staff. They promised to keep an eye out, to check the security footage from the ferry and their market, and to search the area around the hotel. James thanked them and returned to his room, where he waited, pacing the floor. Isabella, growing increasingly worried, sat on the couch, scrolling through her phone in silence. James could tell that she was already imagining the worst-case scenario, that someone had stolen the wallet, that everything inside it would be gone, and that the rest of their trip would be ruined. But as the hours ticked by and no call came, James's optimism began to fade. The staff had reported nothing. No one had found the wallet. No one had turned it in. The weight of the situation pressed down on him. It wasn't just about the loss of money, the inconvenience of canceled credit cards, or even the time it would take to replace the documents. What troubled him most was the feeling of vulnerability, of being exposed in a way he hadn't felt in years. Was he being naive? Had his generosity, his willingness to give, made him a target? Isabella, sensing her father's growing frustration, stood up from the couch. "Dad, it's okay," she said softly. "We'll figure it out. It's just a wallet. But maybe we should think about the people we're trying to help. You know, what if they didn't see us as good people trying to help? Maybe they saw us as—" "Don't," James interrupted, shaking his head. "Let's not assume anything. I still believe in people, in their kindness." But even as he said the words, he wondered if his own faith in humanity was beginning to crack. As the night drew on, the hotel room felt heavier. The search continued, but James could feel the unease spreading throughout his body. They were so close to the heart of this city, so close to the dreams they had been building. Yet somehow, a small, lost wallet now seemed like the missing piece that could unravel everything. James closed his eyes, trying to push away the worry. But deep down, he knew something had changed. The silence in the hotel room grew heavier as the minutes ticked by. Isabella sat on the edge of her bed, arms crossed tightly, her face etched with frustration. The disappointment she felt from the day's events had morphed into something deeper, a confusion, maybe even anger about what had happened. Her fingers absent-mindedly twisted a strand of her hair as she stared out the window at the city lights twinkling below, her thoughts far away. "I just don't understand, Dad," she said, breaking the silence. Her voice was quiet but filled with a mixture of disbelief and frustration. "We went to that neighborhood to help, to show kindness, and this is what happens. Someone took advantage of us. I don't know anymore." James watched his daughter, her eyes clouded with emotions she couldn't fully understand. Her world had been one of privilege, of opportunities and comforts that he'd worked hard to provide. But in this moment, she was struggling to reconcile what she had witnessed: the poverty, the hunger, the desperation, and the harsh reality of the world they were trying to help. James sighed and sat beside her, his calm demeanor never wavering. He knew that this moment would be important for both of them, a lesson that perhaps was meant to be learned in a way neither of them had anticipated. It was time to share the story that had shaped his life and his decisions. "I understand why you're upset, Isabella," he began, his voice gentle. "I know it's hard to understand, especially when all you've known is a life of comfort. But let me tell you something about where I come from." Isabella looked at him, her curiosity piqued. She had always known that her father had grown up in modest circumstances, but she had never truly understood what that meant for him, what it had cost him to get where he was. "I grew up in a small town in Canada," James continued, his gaze far away as if recalling memories from a time long past. "We weren't wealthy. We didn't have much. My parents worked long hours just to make ends meet, and from a young age, I knew I had to help. I worked in every odd job I could find, cleaning windows, delivering newspapers, whatever it took to support my family." James paused for a moment, his voice softening as he looked at Isabella. "I didn't have the luxury of dreaming big back then. Every day was about survival, about making sure we had food on the table. But there was always a fire inside me, a drive that pushed me to do more. I knew, deep down, that if I worked hard enough, if I was persistent enough, I could change my circumstances. And I did." Isabella's eyes softened as she listened. She had always admired her father's success, but hearing the pain behind his words made her see him in a new light. She had never fully understood the sacrifices he had made, the hard work and the struggles that had led him to the life they now had. James took a deep breath before continuing. But even as I built my career, life was never easy. When your mother was diagnosed with cancer, it was the hardest thing I've ever faced. I watched the woman I loved, your mother, fight for her life, and eventually, I had to let her go. Her death shattered me, Isabella. It took everything I had to keep going. Tears welled up in Isabella's eyes as she reached for his hand. She had never heard him speak so openly about her mother's death. To her, it had always been an unspoken sorrow, something he carried quietly. She had felt the absence of her mother, but hearing how much her father had suffered made her heart ache for him in a way she hadn't known before. But in the midst of all that pain, James said, his voice steady but thick with emotion, I realized something. It's not the wealth or the success that matters. It's what you do with it. Your mother's passing taught me that the only way to truly find meaning in life is by helping others, by giving back. That's why I've spent so much of my life investing in communities, building schools, providing healthcare, offering opportunities to those who need it the most. He looked directly into her eyes, his gaze unwavering. We're not meant to hoard wealth or live in luxury, Isabella. We're meant to use what we have to make the world a better place. And I know it's hard to see it right now, especially after today. But this is why I've always been so passionate about helping the less fortunate. I've seen firsthand what it's like to struggle, to feel hopeless. And that's why I keep going, even when things get difficult. Isabella swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking deep into her heart. She had never fully understood her father's motivations, the fire that burned so brightly inside him to help others. But now, as he spoke, she began to see the bigger picture. The loss of the wallet, the frustrations of the day, all felt insignificant in comparison to the greater mission her father had set for himself. I just want you to understand that kindness, generosity, these aren't weaknesses, Isabella, James continued. Sometimes it may seem like people take advantage of us, like they don't appreciate our efforts. But that's not why we do it. We do it because it's the right thing to do. And no matter how tough it gets, no matter how many times we feel like we've been wronged, we keep giving. Because in the end, it's those small acts of kindness that can change someone's life. Isabella wiped away a tear, her eyes filled with understanding. I get it now, Dad. I really do. I was so focused on the loss, on the disappointment of today. But what matters is the difference we're making. I'm sorry for not seeing it sooner. James smiled softly, squeezing her hand. You don't have to apologize. This is a lesson we all learn in our own time. But now you understand why I do what I do. And maybe, just maybe, you'll want to join me in making the world a better place, one small act at a time. The room felt different now, the air lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from both their shoulders. Isabella, for the first time, understood her father's heart, the true heart of a philanthropist, driven not by the desire for wealth, but by the need to give, to make a difference. And in that moment, she realized that the journey they were on, the journey of kindness and giving, was far more important than anything else they could ever possess. Let's make sure we don't give up, Isabella said, her voice resolute. We'll keep helping. We'll keep giving. I want to be a part of this, Dad. I want to help too. James nodded, his eyes filled with pride. And I'll be here, guiding you every step of the way. As they sat there together, father and daughter, the connection between them deepened. It wasn't just about wealth or success. It was about the legacy of giving, of changing lives, and knowing that, despite the challenges, they were on the right path. The following morning, as James sipped his coffee in the hotel room, the phone rang sharply, breaking the quiet. He picked it up quickly, and on the other end, a gravelly voice spoke. Is this Mr. James Kensington? I believe I have something of yours. James sat up straight, his heart giving a small leap. My wallet? He asked, trying to sound casual, though a surge of hope was already rising in his chest. Yes, sir. I found it. It was left behind at the market near the pier, and I've been trying to find a way to return it. James could hardly believe his ears. The wallet, with its cash, cards, and documents, everything that had felt like a loss the day before, had been found. He exchanged a few more words with the caller, confirming the location and agreeing to meet. But when he hung up the phone, Isabella was already by his side, eyebrows furrowed with concern. Dad, are you sure this is safe? We don't know who this person is. It could be a scam. What if they're just trying to trick us? Isabella's voice was filled with worry, her protective instincts kicking in. James set his coffee cup down, his face calm but thoughtful. I understand your concern, Isabella, but I believe the right thing is to give this person the benefit of the doubt. If they wanted something from us, they would have demanded it by now. Besides, we can take precautions. He glanced at the hotel security guard, Mark, who had been assigned to accompany them on various outings during their stay. Mark, are you all right with joining us? Just for safety's sake. The security guard, a seasoned professional with an air of quiet confidence, nodded. Of course, sir. I'll stay close. Isabella, still feeling uneasy, didn't speak further, but the apprehension in her expression was unmistakable. She had never ventured into areas like the one James was planning to visit, and the idea of going into a neighborhood that seemed so different from the life they were used to was intimidating. After a quick checkout from the hotel, the three of them, James, Isabella, and Mark, left the luxury of their surroundings behind. The moment they stepped outside, Isabella felt the contrast. The high-end shopping centers and pristine streets were replaced by cracked sidewalks and bustling streets filled with makeshift stalls and the sounds of vendors haggling with customers. The buildings were older, the air thicker, with the smell of food carts and street dust. She couldn't help but feel a tightness in her chest, a sense of vulnerability she hadn't experienced before. As the car rolled through the area, she couldn't help but glance at her father. James seemed completely at ease, his posture relaxed, his gaze not on the present discomfort, but on the streets they passed. He looked almost nostalgic. I used to walk these streets when I was your age, James said, as if reading her thoughts. His voice was softer now, a hint of something deeper in it. This is where I came from. These neighborhoods, they're not as different from where I grew up. Hard work, perseverance, it was all about survival. It shaped who I am today. Isabella looked at him, a mixture of admiration and confusion in her eyes. You never really talk about it, Dad. I don't like to dwell on the past. James replied with a half smile. But I want you to understand this. These people here, they're doing what they can with what they have, just like I did. They have their own struggles, their own lives. And sometimes the most unexpected things can happen in places like these. She nodded slowly, trying to process his words as they pulled up to a small building at the edge of the market. The walls were worn, the windows cracked, but inside, a few people milled about, talking and laughing among themselves. It felt like a completely different world than the one they'd just left behind at the hotel. Let's go, James said, stepping out of the car, his movements assured. Isabella hesitated for a moment, then followed him, Mark trailing just behind them. They walked into the building, and it took a few moments for their eyes to adjust to the dim lighting. There, standing by a makeshift counter, was a young man in his early 20s. His clothes were worn but clean, his eyes bright with an expression of nervous excitement. In his hands, he held the wallet, the very same one James had lost the day before. It was a strange moment for Isabella. It felt surreal, like something out of a movie. She had never seen anyone so hopeful over something so small. I'm Michael, the young man said, his voice shaking slightly. I found this yesterday. I wasn't sure if anyone would come back for it, but I knew it was important, so I held on to it. James smiled warmly, walking over to him and extending a hand. Thank you, Michael. I'm glad you decided to return it. That means a lot. Michael handed over the wallet, his fingers brushing James's for a split second. Isabella watched closely, still feeling uncertain about everything. The wallet looked just as it had when it had been lost, untouched, everything inside intact. It was as if no time had passed at all. As James examined the wallet, his eyes flicked over the contents. Cash, IDs, credit cards, all accounted for. He turned back to Michael. Is there anything I can do for you in return? He asked, his voice soft but sincere. Michael shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the floor for a moment. I don't want charity, he muttered. But if you could help me out with a little bit, I've been struggling, and I'm trying to keep my little sister in school. James nodded, his expression thoughtful. I understand. How about I help you with school supplies, and I can connect you with someone who can guide you toward more opportunities? Isabella watched, awe slowly replacing her nervousness. She had thought this situation would be dangerous or a scam, but instead, she saw something else. A young man, much like her father had once been, doing his best to care for his family. There was honesty in his eyes. Michael looked up, eyes wide. "You'd really do that? Thank you." James smiled again. "It's the least I can do. Sometimes the smallest gestures can change lives." Isabella stood quietly beside her father, still processing what had just happened. There, in the heart of a neighborhood that had made her nervous just moments ago, she had witnessed something extraordinary. Generosity, empathy, and the simple power of helping someone in need. It was a moment she would never forget. James and Isabella made their way through the narrow streets, following directions to the address provided by the person who had found the wallet. The further they went, the more the neighborhood transformed from the busy markets and shops to quieter, more modest homes. Buildings were small. Some looked like they were on the brink of collapse, but there was a warmth to the place. The kind of neighborhood where neighbors looked out for one another. As they approached an old wooden house at the end of the street, James's gaze swept over the surroundings. He could see that this was the type of place where people didn't have much, but there was a certain kind of dignity in the way they carried themselves. Standing near a rickety fence, a young boy appeared, holding James's wallet in his hands. He was no more than 13, with short brown hair and clothes that looked like they had been worn for a long time. The boy's face was marked with a mixture of pride and embarrassment as he stepped forward. "Mr. Kensington?" The boy's voice was small, but steady. "Yes, that's me," James replied, stepping forward with a smile. "Thank you for bringing this back. You have no idea how much this means to me." The boy, whose name was Ben, looked down at the wallet for a moment before holding it out. "I didn't take anything," he said quickly, as if to reassure them. "I just found it." James took the wallet, examining it briefly to make sure everything was still inside. Cash, cards, ID, all accounted for. He let out a sigh of relief. "Everything's in order. Thank you again. You've done something incredible today." Ben's cheeks flushed with a mixture of pride and discomfort, and after a beat, he hesitantly added, Could I ask for something in return?" Isabella raised an eyebrow, her protective instincts kicking in. "What do you mean?" she asked cautiously, already feeling that familiar sense of unease that had accompanied her throughout this entire journey. Ben hesitated before speaking again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was hoping you might give me $2. Just 2. I used my last savings to buy a small treat for my sister's birthday." His eyes flicked to the ground, avoiding their gaze. "We don't have much, and I thought maybe I could get something for Lily. Just something small for her birthday." Isabella's expression tightened. She wanted to say something, to urge her father to give him the money and move on. But there was something about the way Ben spoke, so earnestly, so vulnerably, that stopped her. Still, the skeptical part of her mind warned her. What was the catch? Why ask for just $2? James, however, could see through the boy's discomfort. He knelt down to Ben's level, meeting his gaze with an understanding that went beyond words. "I'm happy to help," James said quietly. "But tell me more about you and your sister. What's your story?" Ben looked up, his eyes wide for a moment as if he hadn't expected to be asked that question. Then, slowly, he began to speak, his voice growing steadier as he recounted his life. "I don't really remember my dad," he began, his eyes shifting away as he spoke. "He left when I was just a baby. My mom, Maria, she raised me and my sister, Lily, on her own. But things haven't been easy. About a year ago, we lost our home. My mom tried to keep us going, but it's hard when you don't have enough to get by." Ben paused, his eyes clouding over as he spoke of his mother's struggles. "We've been living on the streets since then. We move around, trying to find a safe place to sleep. It's not always easy, but we're still together." Isabella stood silently, her chest tight as she listened to Ben. It was impossible to imagine what he and his family must have endured. And yet, there was no bitterness in his voice, no anger, just a quiet resilience. "My happiest memory?" Ben's voice cracked slightly as he spoke, and he swallowed before continuing. "It's from when we had a home. I was 7, I think. My mom made a cake for my birthday, even though we didn't have much. It wasn't much, just a small cake, but it was the best birthday I ever had. I felt like I had everything." Isabella felt a pang in her heart. She could barely imagine a birthday like that, one so simple yet so meaningful. It made her think about how she had celebrated her own birthdays, surrounded by plenty, by luxury. And here was Ben, with his memories of a small cake, the joy of a single moment when everything felt right, even if just for a little while. "I'm sorry you've had to go through all this," James said softly, his voice thick with emotion. He looked up at Isabella, who had tears in her eyes, and then back to Ben. "You don't have to ask for just $2. You're going to get more than that, all right?" Ben's eyes widened, his breath catching in his throat. "You mean? Really?" James smiled warmly, pulling out his wallet. "How about I help you and your sister? I'll give you some money to buy what you need and make sure you both have what you need for the next few days." Ben was speechless for a moment, but his face slowly broke into a grin. "Thank you. Thank you so much." He wiped his eyes quickly, trying to hide the emotion that had overwhelmed him. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," James replied, handing Ben a wad of bills. "Take this, buy some food for your sister and your mom, and take care of yourselves." As Ben held the money in his hands, his entire demeanor changed. His shoulders relaxed, and for the first time, he seemed to breathe easier. "Thank you. I'll make sure Lily gets the treat." James nodded. "Take care of each other. And remember, sometimes the smallest gestures, like a treat for a loved one, can mean the world." Isabella watched quietly, her heart moved by the boy's transformation. She had been worried, uncertain about what might happen in this part of the city. But now, seeing Ben's bright eyes, she realized the value of simple kindness. As James and Isabella turned to leave, Ben called out one last time. "Wait," he said, his voice full of sincerity. "Thank you again. You gave me more than just money today. You gave me hope. I won't forget it." Isabella looked at her father, her heart swelling with pride. She had come here to find a lost wallet, but she was leaving with something far more precious. A reminder of the power of kindness and the way one small act of generosity could change a life. As they walked back toward the street, Isabella's mind was swirling. Her heart felt heavier with every step she took. She couldn't shake the image of Ben's face, his quiet pride, his humility, and the deep longing for something so simple, something most people took for granted. She had been so quick to judge, so skeptical of those who had nothing. And now, standing on the same streets she had once looked down upon, she realized just how wrong she had been. Her steps slowed as the weight of Ben's words sunk deeper into her conscience. "A birthday treat for his sister," he had said. "A small cake, a memory of a time when they had a home." The contrast between his story and her own life felt like a cold slap to her face. Here she was, in a city of wealth and opportunity, with everything at her fingertips. And she had been so focused on material things that she had failed to see the struggles of others. Unable to hold back any longer, Isabella's eyes filled with tears. The guilt weighed on her chest like a stone. "Dad, I've been so selfish," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I thought all this," she gestured vaguely to the luxury of the hotel and the wealth surrounding them, "was everything. But I didn't understand. Not really." James, who had been walking beside her, stopped and turned to face his daughter. His eyes softened as he saw her tears. He didn't speak right away, but simply stood there, taking her hands in his. He had been waiting for this moment, the moment when Isabella would realize the true meaning of compassion, when she would understand that wealth was only a tool, not the measure of a life well lived. "Isabella," he said quietly, his voice steady but full of emotion. "None of us are perfect. We all have moments when we don't see the bigger picture. But the important thing is that you're seeing it now. You're starting to understand that the true measure of a person isn't in what they own, but in what they give." Isabella wiped her eyes, still feeling the sting of her earlier assumptions. She glanced back at Ben, who had disappeared into the distance with his wallet now tucked safely under his arm, a lighter step in his stride. That was when it hit her. She had to do something. Not just for Ben, but for his family too. "I want to help them, Dad," Isabella said, her voice filled with newfound resolve. "I know $300 might not change everything, but it can make a difference. It's not much, but it's something." Without waiting for her father's response, she reached into his wallet, pulled out the bills, and turned to him. Her hands shook slightly as she held the money in front of him. I want to give this to Ben. Please, Dad. I need to. James studied his daughter for a moment, feeling a profound sense of pride. He had hoped that one day she would understand this, but seeing it unfold now before his very eyes was a gift that far exceeded any material wealth. Of course, he said, nodding. You're making the right choice, Isabella. Isabella didn't hesitate. She turned on her heels and hurried back toward the small house where she had met Ben. Her father followed closely behind, and for the first time since arriving in this unfamiliar part of the city, Isabella felt a sense of purpose rising within her. It wasn't about the wealth or the luxuries that had once seemed so important. It was about making a difference. It was about showing kindness when it was needed most. When they arrived, Ben and his family had just returned from the small corner store, their heads down as they spoke in hushed tones. Ben was carrying a small bag, a single cupcake inside. It was for his sister, he had said. Isabella approached him slowly, the $300 still clutched in her hands, her heart racing as she finally reached him. Ben, she called softly, and he turned to face her, his face brightening when he saw her standing there. She took a deep breath, her hands outstretched, the money between her palms. This is for you and your family, she said, her voice steady despite the emotions swelling within her. I know it's not much, but I hope it helps. You can use it to buy clothes, food, anything you need. Ben's eyes widened, disbelief flashing across his face. You? Really? For us? He asked, his voice almost breaking. Isabella nodded, her heart full of compassion. Yes, please take it, and use it to take care of yourself and your sister. Ben stood frozen for a moment, the gravity of her words sinking in. He looked down at the money and then back up at her, his lips trembling. I don't know what to say. Thank you. Thank you so much. Isabella smiled warmly, feeling the knot in her chest loosen. This, she realized, was what it was all about. It wasn't the money. It wasn't the luxury. It was the chance to help, to show kindness, to offer someone else the opportunity for a better life. I'm glad I could help, she said softly. And I hope you and your family can start a new chapter now. You deserve it. Ben looked over at his mother, Maria, who had been watching from a distance, and then at his younger sister, Lily, standing quietly by the door. He stepped forward, holding the money tightly in his hands. I'll make sure my mom gets this. Thank you again. I won't forget this. Isabella nodded, her heart swelling. Take care of each other, she said, turning to walk back toward the car, James following closely behind. As they left, Isabella looked at her father, her eyes full of gratitude. Thank you for always showing me what really matters, she said quietly. I understand now. James smiled, his heart full as he placed a hand on her shoulder. You've learned the most important lesson, Isabella, that kindness doesn't have to be grand to be meaningful. It just has to be real. And as father and daughter walked away, they both knew that this experience had changed them forever. In a single moment, they had found not only a lost wallet, but a deeper understanding of what it truly meant to give. As James and Isabella made their way back to the hotel, the streets of San Diego bustling with tourists and locals alike, James glanced over at his daughter. She seemed deep in thought, her gaze focused on the passing scenery. Yet there was a peacefulness about her that he hadn't seen in a long while. Her earlier gesture, giving the money to Ben and his family, had changed something in her, and he could sense it. I was thinking, Isabella began, breaking the silence, her voice hesitant as she glanced at her father. Maybe we should skip the fancy restaurant tonight. James raised an eyebrow in surprise. He had planned a grand dinner to celebrate her 18th birthday, something special to mark her coming of age. It was a tradition in their family to go all out for milestone birthdays. But Isabella wasn't done. She looked at him with a quiet determination in her eyes. Instead of the expensive dinner, what if we just ordered pizza? I mean, it doesn't have to be all about the luxury, right? She said, her words sincere, almost shy. James was momentarily taken aback. This was not the daughter he knew, the one who had loved the indulgences of high-end restaurants and designer shopping sprees. But in her voice, he heard something far more meaningful than the surface-level suggestion of pizza. He saw maturity, kindness, and a heart that had shifted in just one evening. You want to spend the money helping others, don't you? James asked, his voice full of both surprise and pride. Isabella nodded. I do. I don't want to waste the money when there's a family that could use it more than we can. We'll be fine with pizza, and it's better if we can help Ben's family have a better start. James felt a rush of warmth flood his chest. For years, he had tried to teach Isabella that true wealth wasn't about what you could buy, but what you could give away. And now, here she was, living those lessons herself. I'm proud of you, Isabella. Let's do it. Let's make this birthday about something more meaningful. Isabella smiled, her eyes lighting up with the same warmth that now filled her father's heart. Thanks, Dad. I promise, this will be a birthday I'll never forget. Later that evening, as James and Isabella sat in their hotel suite with a few large boxes of pizza between them, they couldn't help but feel that something bigger than just a meal was being shared. Laughter filled the room as they chatted over slices of pizza, the air lighter than it had been all week. This was more than just a dinner. It was a celebration of new beginnings, of giving, and of the unexpected bonds that life had to offer. Meanwhile, across town, Ben and his family were having a completely different experience. The $300 Isabella had given them had been a lifeline, and they had used it carefully, picking out new clothes for each family member, something they hadn't been able to afford in over a year. Maria, Ben's mother, smiled through her tears as she helped her children into their new clothes. It wasn't just the clothes that made her heart swell. It was the overwhelming sense of hope that now filled their home. For the first time in a long while, they weren't just surviving. They were starting to live again. Ben had never seen his mother so happy, and for once, he felt the weight of responsibility lift from his shoulders, if only for a moment. He could finally let go of the constant worry that consumed him. And instead, he allowed himself to enjoy the simple pleasures: a hot meal, new clothes, and the knowledge that his family was no longer going to bed hungry. The next morning, after a restful night's sleep, the family made their way to the hotel, hearts full of hope and anticipation. Ben couldn't stop grinning as he walked hand in hand with Lily, his younger sister. She was still too young to fully understand the gravity of what had happened, but Ben felt the difference. Today was a new beginning for them. When they arrived at the hotel, the sight of the luxurious lobby, with its sparkling chandeliers and soft lighting, was a stark contrast to the life they had been living just the day before. It felt surreal, almost too good to be true. James and Isabella were waiting for them by the entrance, and as soon as Ben saw Isabella, he waved excitedly. Isabella smiled warmly, her heart swelling with happiness at the sight of Ben and his family, so much different than when they had first met. She stepped forward, and Ben immediately reached out, grateful for everything she had done for them. "Ben, I'm so happy to see you," Isabella said, her voice full of warmth and sincerity. "How are you all doing?" "We're doing great, thanks to you," Ben replied, his voice cracking with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you. Everything has changed: clothes, food, even a safe place to sleep. You've really given us a second chance." Isabella looked at him, the tears from the previous day still fresh in her eyes. "I'm just glad I could help. You deserve so much more than what life has thrown at you." James stepped forward and smiled at Ben's mother, Maria, who stood quietly behind him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "It's good to meet you, Maria," he said, shaking her hand. "I know it's been tough, but I'm glad you and your family have found a way forward." Maria smiled through her tears. "Thank you, Mr. Kensington. You have no idea what this means to us. You've given us more than just money. You've given us hope." Isabella's heart swelled with pride as she saw the difference she had made. Not only had they helped Ben's family, but in doing so, they had found something even more precious: the realization that sometimes the most meaningful moments are those when you least expect them. Later, as Ben and his family were treated to a special birthday lunch at the hotel, Isabella reflected on everything that had happened. She had thought this would be just another trip, another year of luxury and indulgence. But it had become so much more. It was a lesson she would carry with her forever, a reminder that the greatest gifts were the ones we gave to others. As the day drew to a close, Isabella looked at her father, her heart full of gratitude. She had learned what true wealth meant, and she knew that no matter where life took her, the power of kindness would always be her guiding light. As the afternoon sun bathed the hotel's lush garden in a warm golden light, the scent of blooming flowers filled the air. Isabella and James stood at the entrance, watching as Ben, Lily, and their mother, Maria, were escorted into the grand celebration, their faces wide with wonder. It was a sight that none of them would ever forget. Ben and Lily, both wide-eyed and smiling in their new clothes, were now stepping into a world so far removed from the one they had known for years. The garden was filled with families enjoying the afternoon, their laughter mingling with the soft melody of a string quartet in the background. As Ben and Lily walked among the guests, their eyes darting around in awe at the fancy dishes, the elegant decorations, and the cheerful chatter that seemed so foreign to them. For the first time, they were able to experience luxury not as bystanders, but as guests. It was as though they had entered a dream that had seemed impossible just days ago. Isabella smiled as she watched them interact with the other children, their smiles genuine and unguarded. It was an innocence she had almost forgotten, a purity of joy that came from experiencing something new and beautiful. She realized in that moment why her father had always been so committed to helping others. It wasn't just about money or charity. It was about giving people a chance to experience life's simplest pleasures, to feel seen and valued. She turned to her father, her eyes filled with understanding. "Dad, this is what it's all about, isn't it? This is why you help." James nodded, a gentle smile playing on his lips. "Yes, Isabella. It's not just about giving people money. It's about giving them opportunities to live, to dream, to find happiness, just as we have." Isabella felt a swell of emotion as she watched Ben and his family laugh and dance with the other guests, their faces glowing with a happiness they hadn't known in so long. This wasn't just about a party or a meal. It was about hope. It was about turning the page to a new chapter in their lives. Meanwhile, James was deep in conversation with the hotel manager, discussing the family's circumstances. He was impressed by Maria's quiet dignity, her strength, and her resilience in the face of adversity. She had endured so much, yet she carried herself with grace, never asking for pity, always putting her children's well-being first. James had a keen eye for recognizing potential, and Maria's character spoke volumes. After the discussion, James pulled Maria aside. "Maria," he said with a warm smile, "I've been speaking with the manager, and we'd like to offer you something. Your work ethic and your strength are impressive. We'd like to offer you a position here as head chambermaid." Maria's eyes widened, disbelief overtaking her for a moment. She had always been willing to work, but the idea of working in such a prestigious hotel, with a steady job that could provide for her children, was beyond her wildest dreams. Her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. I don't know what to say. I've never imagined anything like this. You're giving me a chance to give my children a better life." James placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You've earned it, Maria. You're a woman of integrity and hard work, and that's the kind of person we want on our team. Take this opportunity, not just for you, but for Ben and Lily. A new beginning awaits." Tears welled up in Maria's eyes as she nodded, overwhelmed by the gesture of kindness and trust. "I will work hard, Mr. Kensington. I promise you, I'll do everything I can to repay this chance." James smiled warmly, proud of the strength and determination that radiated from Maria. He knew that with this job, she would be able to rebuild her life, providing a stable future for her children, and giving them the opportunity to thrive. This wasn't just charity. This was an investment in someone's potential, a chance to break free from the cycle of poverty. As the party continued, the sun began to set, casting a soft amber glow over the garden. The laughter and music filled the air, blending with the sounds of a new chapter being written in Ben and Maria's lives. For the first time in years, the family felt as though they belonged, as though they had a future that was worth fighting for. James and Isabella stood together, watching the celebration unfold, a sense of fulfillment settling over them both. Isabella looked at her father, her heart full. She had always admired him, but today she truly understood the depth of his work, his generosity, and the life he had chosen to live. "Dad," she said softly, her voice full of gratitude, "thank you for showing me what really matters." James smiled, his eyes filled with pride. "I'm just glad you're learning it on your own, Isabella. The best gift you can give in life is to help others." And that's a lesson I'll always be proud of passing on. As the stars began to twinkle in the sky above, Isabella realized that her father's legacy wasn't just in the wealth he had accumulated, but in the lives he had touched, the people he had helped, and the hope he had given to those who needed it most. This was the true meaning of wealth, and it was a lesson she would carry with her for the rest of her life. The morning light filtered gently through the curtains of the hotel room, casting soft shadows across the floor. Maria sat at the small table, a cup of coffee in her hands, her mind racing as she thought about the opportunity she had just been given. The weight of it settled over her like a comforting embrace. This job at the hotel was not just a job. It was a new life, a chance to rebuild everything she had lost, to create a future that Ben and Lily could be proud of. Her fingers trembled slightly as she looked down at the contract she had just signed. It was the first step toward security, a way to provide for her children in a way she had never imagined possible. The tears that had once been a constant companion, brought on by worry and hopelessness, had dried up over time. Now, they were replaced with something far more powerful: gratitude and a deep sense of purpose. As she looked out the window at the vast ocean in the distance, she reflected on the years she had spent on the streets, struggling to survive, trying to give Ben and Lily a sense of normalcy despite the chaos around them. Every night she had prayed for a miracle, for a way out. And now here she was, standing on the edge of that miracle, ready to walk into a future full of possibilities. Maria had already made plans in her mind. With her new job, she would be able to send Ben and Lily to school, something she had always dreamed of, but never thought she could afford. She would buy them uniforms, school supplies, and even a few toys so they could experience the joy of being children again. She would finally be able to give them a life that wasn't just about surviving, but truly living. For the first time in years, Maria felt hope for the future. She felt like she could breathe again, like the weight that had crushed her for so long was finally being lifted. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living, and she was going to make sure that her children would live too, with every opportunity they deserved. Meanwhile, James and Isabella were enjoying the last few days of their trip. Their bond had deepened in ways that neither of them had expected. Isabella, once focused solely on the material pleasures of life, had learned to see things through a different lens. She no longer saw her father's generosity as a mere act of kindness. She now understood it as a way of life. Every smile from a person he had helped, every word of gratitude he received, spoke volumes about the impact one person could have on the world. Isabella had learned that happiness wasn't found in wealth or luxury. It was found in the ability to make a difference in the lives of others, to create a ripple of kindness that could touch the hearts of people who needed it the most. The joy she had once felt at receiving gifts and attention now seemed fleeting compared to the lasting joy that came from giving. She looked at her father one afternoon as they sat by the hotel's pool, the soft hum of the city in the background. "Dad," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "I want to do more. I want to help people, like you do. I want to make a difference." James turned to her, a proud smile spreading across his face. "I'm so glad you're feeling that way, Isabella. Helping others isn't always easy, but it's the most rewarding thing you'll ever do. I know you have the heart for it. Just keep looking for opportunities to make a change, and never forget that the smallest act of kindness can have the biggest impact." Isabella nodded, a newfound determination in her heart. She wasn't just a young woman enjoying her birthday anymore. She was someone who understood the power of giving. She could see how the smallest gesture could transform someone's world. Just like how Ben's family had been changed in a single moment by the kindness they had received. As the days passed and their time in San Diego came to an end, Isabella was no longer the same person who had arrived. She was more compassionate, more aware of the world around her, and more committed to doing her part to make the world a better place. She would never forget the lessons she had learned from Ben's family and the transformation that had occurred not only in their lives, but in her own. The trip came to a close, but the impact of what had transpired would last far beyond those few days in California. James and Isabella boarded their flight home, but as the plane soared high above the clouds, they both knew that they had carried something far more valuable with them than souvenirs or luxury. They had carried the gift of understanding, the gift of kindness, and the gift of a new chapter in their lives, one that would guide them as they moved forward, with purpose and with heart. Back at the hotel, Maria stood tall as she prepared for her first day of work. She had a new sense of confidence, a new sense of purpose. She was no longer just a mother struggling to survive. She was a woman with a future, a woman who was building something better for her children. As she walked through the hotel's grand hallways, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for the opportunity she had been given. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, she felt as though she could face it head on. And as the door to her new life opened, Maria smiled, knowing that the greatest gift she could give her children wasn't just food or shelter. It was the gift of hope, the gift of a chance at a better life. And with that, she stepped into her new chapter, ready to write her own story. And so this story reminds us all that no act of kindness is ever too small to make a lasting impact. Whether it's helping a stranger, sharing a few words of encouragement, or simply offering a hand to someone in need, we all have the power to change the world. If this story touched your heart, if it inspired you to do good and make a difference, then don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that remind us of the beauty in kindness and the power we all have to change lives. Let's spread positivity together. Share your thoughts below and join us on this journey of giving.